All right, we've reached number 21, the island country of São Tomé and Príncipe. Geography. This country is comprised of two main islands, São Tomé and Príncipe. Sitting in the Gulf of Guinea, they both are ancient extinct shield volcanoes, part of the Cameroon line that includes Annobon and Bioko, and continues onto the mainland with Mount Cameroon. The hotspot has long since left them, precluding any eruptions, or so we think. The equator passes just south of São Tomé, and the islands have a seasonal tropical climate, a short dry season June to September, which means it occurs during the northern hemisphere's summer, which is unusual in the tropics, though temperatures don't vary much throughout the year. Pico de São Tomé reaches over 6,600 feet, 2,000 meters, where the climate becomes cooler. The islands originally were covered in rainforest, though much has since been cleared. They are home to species of plants and animals found nowhere else, especially birds. Whales also like to hang out along the shores. Portuguese São Tomé and Príncipe. Unlike neighboring Bioko, neither island is known to have been inhabited or even visited before the 15th century. A dynamic duo of Portuguese explorers, João de Santarém and Pero Escobar, discovered São Tomé, Príncipe, and Annobon between December 1471 and January 1472. In Equatorial Guinea's episode, I said Fernão Dupont might have found the latter, but these two guys seem to have done it. Anyway, as you might have guessed, the devout Portuguese named the islands after whoever's feast day it was on discovery. São Tomé for St. Thomas the Apostle, and Príncipe, originally Santo Antão, after Saint Anthony the Great. Besides adventure and discovery, the Portuguese were out so far from home for the promise of riches in the form of gold, ivory, spices, and silks, and all the Cameroon Line islands looked attractive as bases in the Gulf of Guinea, uninhabited but close to the mainland. After some more exploration in Africa and Asia, 1493, São Tomé, presumably along with little Annobon, was granted as a captaincy to develop on behalf of the crown, followed by Fernão Dupont the next year. 1500, the same happened to Santo Antão, but King João II decided to rename the island Príncipe, after his beloved deceased son, Prince Afonso. The town, however, kept the old name, now written as Santo Antonio. 1522, the Portuguese crown annexed all the islands, subsuming them under a new Captaincy General of Guinea, managing their territories in West Africa. Claiming the islands was the easy part, though. They still had to be settled. Many Iberian Sephardic Jews, expelled from Portugal, were among the first settlers, though it was rough. Those who survived the trip found fertile islands, and soon slaves were brought from Guinea, Congo, and Angola to work the new sugar plantations. The islands became a major producer of sugar by the mid-16th century, but began to fall behind with the development of larger sugar operations in the Caribbean and Brazil. The slaves, understandably, often proved difficult to control by Portuguese authorities distracted with developments elsewhere. We'll talk more about it in our episode about Ghana, but in the first half of the 17th century, Portugal was engaged in a long war with the Dutch. São Tomé got caught up in the particular campaign in Angola, and was captured by the Dutch in 1641. The Portuguese took it back in 1648, but the Dutch plundering of the island didn't do the sugar industry any favors. Thereafter, the islands shifted to entrepôts between Africa and the Atlantic, especially for exporting slaves to the Americas. 1752, the islands are combined into one captaincy, capitaled from Santo Antonio, right in the middle. 1778, Portugal and Spain signed the Treaty of El Pardo, securing Portuguese Brazil's southern border. In exchange, Portugal gave Spain Fernão Dupont and Annobon, and trading rights on the mainland, the origin of modern Equatorial Guinea. 1822, Portugal lost large and wealthy Brazil, and clung tighter to her African colonies, designating them as overseas provinces in 1836. It was also around this time that the European empires, after hundreds of years of the slave trade and economy, were re-evaluating their stances on the matter. Britain led the charge with the blockade of Africa, and the Portuguese colonies had to find some other way of making money besides slavery. So they did. São Tomé and Príncipe shifted back to cash crops, specifically coffee and chocolate, eventually becoming the world's largest producer of the latter. With renewed importance, São Tomé became the province's capital. 1869, slavery was finally abolished, but forced labor conditions continued on the plantations, though the workers were paid a little. Labor unrest and riots would be frequent problems, but evidently not enough to actually do much about it. 1891 was a fateful year for Portugal in Africa, with the end of her grand ambitions in Zambezia at the hands of Britain. Possibly as compensation, Portugal referred to Angola and Mozambique as the states of West and East Africa. I found São Tomé and Príncipe referred to as Portuguese Central Africa, so maybe they followed suit. I couldn't find the source again, though. Either way, they all go back to provinces in 1893. 1910, Portugal was reeling from Britain's 1890 ultimatum, economic slump, bankruptcy, political polarization, the assassination of the king 2 years before. Ultimately, the Republicans couped and abolished the monarchy. Things didn't really improve under the First Republic, aggravated by joining World War I in 1916, then the 1917 coup, a 1919 civil war, and finally killed in the 1926 military dictatorship. Probably to focus more on the motherland, the overseas provinces became colonies. 1933, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar created his Estado Novo regime, which will have to be explored in Portugal's episode. But in 1951, it returned the colonies to provinces. At a time when the other European empires were under pressure from the USA and the USSR to relinquish theirs, Portugal and Spain were trying their best to hold on. The idea was Portugal constituted a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-continental, but unified one Portuguese Catholic nation. To grant those overseas provinces independence would be absolutely unacceptable. But the so-called Portuguese countrymen of these overseas provinces thought differently. The colonial war erupted in 1961, but only on the mainland in Africa. The island colonies of São Tomé and Príncipe and Cape Verde were relatively quiet. As an aside, São Tomé served as a base for humanitarian aid during the brutal Nigerian Civil War between 1967 to 1970. Portugal put up a good fight for 13 years, calling its overseas provinces states again in 1972 to prove their point. But by 1974, the Portuguese people were spent, and the Carnation Revolution overthrew the Estado Novo. If Portugal had wanted to, she might have been able to retain São Tomé and Príncipe, but she didn't. She was done with empire after 500 years. An arrangement was made to hand power over to the Marxist-Leninist Movement for the Liberation of São Tomé and Príncipe, the MLSTP, and on July 12, 1975, the islands became independent as the República Democrática de São Tomé e Príncipe, the Democratic Republic of São Tomé and Príncipe. It's just the name of the country again. In stark contrast to Mozambique and Angola, there would be no ruinous civil war in São Tomé and Príncipe, but Manuel Pinto da Costa took over as president, and as a good little communist, he created a one-party socialist republic and nationalized the country's plantations. He also cultivated relations with fellow Marxist-Leninist Angola and the Warsaw Pact. He couldn't find much in the way of totalitarian excess like in nearby Equatorial Guinea. Communist São Tomé and Príncipe probably just became a boring, bureaucratic, authoritarian police state like the Soviet Union post-Khrushchev. The economic recession in the 80s prompted market reforms and foreign investment, and the end of the Cold War meant democratic reform was inevitable for this to continue. 1990, opposition parties were legalized, and in 1991, Miguel Trovoada won the presidency. Despite a few bumps along the road, São Tomé and Príncipe has transitioned into a fully functioning democratic republic, giving substance to its name. With regular transfers of power, it's considered one of the most stable and free countries in Africa. The economy is still mostly agrarian, and the people remain fairly poor. But education, healthcare, and infrastructure are improving. Tourism has been on the rise, and efforts are being made to find oil deposits offshore, just like all her neighbors. With strong civil institutions and freedoms, I'm confident the rest will come in time. Well, that was pleasant. Episodes go a little faster when their history only begins within the last 500 years. The next episode, however, will take us to Cameroon, whose history is a lot older. I can't wait. See you next time.